Hello again, I'm Nicola Curtin, Program Evaluator here at the COE, and I want to talk to you a little bit about, in this lecture, designing inclusive demographic questions. And I sort of have a small disclaimer, which is that this is certainly not comprehensive. The purpose really is just to sort of give you an overview of some of the issues you might want to consider when you're asking people to report on their demographics, and you really want to be inclusive in how you do that. I hope you'll understand, both after this lecture, and I'll just sort of say it now, right, that some of these issues apply to the entire survey, right, that you really want to think about in all the questions you ask, is this appropriate for the people that I'm speaking with, that I'm communicating with through this survey? Is this respectful of who they are? We'll sort of talk about some of the broader issues. So you really want to think about this about your whole survey, but I'm going to focus here. And as I said, in a very sort of 10,000 foot view on demographic questions. And I think it's also important to understand that these issues apply to interview and focus group studies, right? But I think sometimes that we maybe are more aware of them in those contexts because, of course, they involve us speaking directly to people. So we kind of, I think, sometimes maybe center our respondents a bit more carefully when we do those kinds of studies, although, not necessarily. So, and of course, we'll get back to this, but all the sort of same general program evaluation tenets apply here too, but we're just going to take a closer look at this demo questions. So again, a survey is a form of communication. I just can't say this enough, right? You are communicating with your survey respondents, even if you're not there in the moment in which you're doing so. And today we're going to talk about just, we're most effective at communication when people feel respected and understood, right? That's sort of where we're going to focus. I said in my survey lecture, we'd sort of dive deeper, and that's what we're doing right now. I think it's really important to understand that our surveys also communicate what we think is important, at least in terms of our evaluation, and that's appropriate, right? But it is a message to our participants. It's also sometimes we communicate, and we might not even be thinking about it when we do this, what's normal or normative with our questions. In other words, our response categories, for example, and we'll talk about this a little bit, tell our participants something about who we expect they are or what we expect they might feel. And again, there's nothing wrong with this, but it is really important to remember that as you are thinking about your questions. And it's also the case, just as it's the case when we're talking in the real world, but that our surveys and how we design them are oftentimes informed by our assumptions about the world. Again, I'm not arguing that any of this is inherently a bad thing, but it really is something we want to be self-aware about, right? That we want to really be sure that the things we are communicating are the things that we would really want to be communicating to our survey participants. And if some of this seems kind of abstract right now, hopefully as we go through some of the questions, it'll really kind of clarify for you what I mean by, when I'm talking about, well, what's normative. So I want to note that there's not a ton of research in this area, but there's actually some really interesting work. There's actually a lot of work on the surveys as communication, but there's some also interesting work on this question of how do we ask about maybe what might be in this moment of time, right, particularly sensitive issues around gender identity, et cetera. And it'll be so interesting in 20 years, right, to sort of see if we've moved in a new, different, hopefully better direction. So, but we do know that how we ask questions, of course, affects how participants or respondents understand those questions in lots of different ways. But it also affects how they feel, if they feel that we've understood them. And it also actually affects what they think about the person conducting the survey. And I'll talk about this in a moment. There's some interesting research on this. So basically, in other words, again, this all sort of underscores this is a communication, right? And just as we're communicating with with our respondents, they're forming ideas, about us. And that's actually particularly important when you're a program evaluator, because you're representing in some ways a program that you care about. And particularly if you're addressing your clients, your patients, you want them to know, right, that you care about them. That's why you designed a program. And so it's really important that you think about those things and really hold them central, I think, as you're designing your survey. So imagine here that you are Charlie, that you identify as gender fluid and queer, and you're completing a survey and you see these two questions. And the first question is, what is your gender, male or female? And the second question, what is your sexual orientation, heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual? How are you going to respond and how are you going to feel? So I want you to sort of think about that for a minute. And this is really what I mean when I say we communicate with our participants. And I want to sort of talk here about this issue I brought up about normativity, right? That what we're communicating here to our participant is that we assume that there are two genders, that they're binary categories, that our participant will fit in those two binary categories, right? So we're sort of telling our participant right in this moment that they are not normal to us, that we actually haven't even given them a space where they can be represented. And again, it's sort of, if you take a step back and you extrapolate, people who are gender fluid and queer are probably quite used to, for better or worse, these interactions. But what does that say then about our program, right? And the space that we are creating for them. And I think that's really important, that question about normativity. I also just want to note that the terminology here can be problematic. That, for example, the term, and this is where we're really in, I think, complicated territory. I mean, this stuff is like, I love to nerd out on this because I think we're sort of in complicated territory here, right? Like different communities use different kinds of terminology, but I just want to note particularly the term homosexual now is rejected by a lot of members of the LGBT community because it's sort of a medicalized term in some ways. It has this kind of history. So again, there's like a lot going on in these two questions that on the face of it might just be, you might have looked at them and said, but these are great questions, right? Or these are pretty typical questions. So I want to sort of start from here. And of course, as I said, this can apply to all kinds of questions. This isn't like, Charlie isn't the only person who might feel alienated by responses. We might ask, for example, about race, and we might ask it in a mutually exclusive way. And so, what about people who are biracial? Where would they put themselves, right? So sort of think about all of these categories and on all of these identities and how they're lived. And, I want to know, we can't be perfect in our accounting for them, but I think we can probably do better than we did here. So I think, I want to sort of first address this question of like to ask or not to ask, right? Like I just sort of gave you this example and we're thinking about Charlie and you think, oh, it's very stressful to sort of think about these issues and maybe we just don't ask. And indeed, actually, there's some really interesting conversations happening about different survey experts or just different folks. Like, do we even ask about race, like, or gender or whatnot? Like, if these are social categories or if they're sensitive, should we ask about them? And I'm going to make the argument that, of course, it depends on what your evaluation is about, but that things like race and ethnicity and gender, sexual orientation, it's not that they are important categories because they're real or not, right? Like that there's such an objective thing as race or gender. Of course, they're real experiences. I'm not denying that, right? There's a lot of conversation, though, about how these categories are, a lot of theory about how these categories are kind of socially constructed. And I'm not going to get into that. But what I'm going to argue is that demographic categories are oftentimes consequential. And what I mean by that is that race and indeed actually gender doesn't predict all these things, but that race, right, in the US predicts differential incarceration rates. It predicts health disparities, educational disparities, wealth distribution. It's consequential, meaning it helps us actually understand these really important social issues. And if we don't have race, let's say, if we don't account for it, then we're really not fully understanding these issues. Now, all these issues are, of course, complex and they have lots of different things that affect them. That's not really, the argument isn't about what's the most important thing, but it's about these categories are consequential, and they may indeed be consequential to our program evaluation. And that's, of course, where we want to start, right, when we think about what we're going to ask. You need to determine whether or not a particular kind of demographic information, just like with your survey questions, whether they're important to your evaluation. And if they're important to your evaluation, then you really need to think about how are you going to best ask them in a way that is going to invite all of your participants and your respondents to feel seen, to be able to communicate who they are. And basically, at the end of the day, it's to give you the best information possible, right? Like, I care about these things, and probably you do too, because we care about social justice and we care about people feeling included, but also you care about your data, right? And so you want to have the best, most usable data. And we'll talk about that too, because there are some interesting tensions there. It may be the case that you decide you don't need to or want to ask about a particular identity category, and I think that's totally fine. We don't always have to ask people their gender, for example. Maybe you have very strong evidence to believe that it's not important to the particular evaluation question at hand. Do not feel like you have to exhaustively ask people about every aspect of their identity just to do it, right? Maybe that all or most of your respondents share the same identity. Maybe you are operating a program for young men of color, and everybody sort of shares that particular identity. When I talk about of color, that might include actually, though, a number of different racial groups. So again, you have to sort of think about what do you know about your participants. Not everybody identifies with the category of men in the same way, right? Like, these are kind of these big questions, but that they do matter for us here too. Maybe though, that it would be culturally inappropriate to ask about a particular identity or an issue, and maybe that would alienate the people that you'd actually need information from, right, that you want to serve. And so again, there can be very compelling reasons. I am not at all arguing that you should ask that you should always ask questions in the same way for every survey, and that you should include all of these issues. But these are all of these identity categories. These are just things to sort of think about. But I think really at the end of the day, especially as a program evaluator, we sort of have these two things in mind, right? One is that we want information to make our programs better, to better support our people running our programs, to better, to give information to our donors that will mean that they'll continue to fund our programs. But we also want to better serve our clients and patients. So there's really some onus here on us to really think about these issues. So I am not actually, I don't believe that there is a formula for this to ask about identity in an inclusive way. And so really the purpose of this lecture in some ways is just to ask you some questions and get you thinking. It's not to say, here's the formula that you should follow. It's very helpful to know the communities that you're surveying, right? Are there particular terms used for gender or race? Will some questions offend them or make them uncomfortable, right? And if you're not familiar with the community, really strongly consider consulting with someone who is, getting a community advisor to help you really create the best evaluation. This may be particularly important if you are consulting on a program you're not that familiar with. The same question might not be suitable for every questionnaire. You might have a question about gender identity or gender that you're like, this is the best question ever, I'm going to keep this. And maybe it will work across contexts, but it doesn't mean it'll work in every instance. I think it's really important to be aware of the fact that terminology within communities can change very quickly, and it's important that you work to understand what the current kind of norms and preferences are. And I think you give some examples here, right, that the term transgendered, we used to hear that a lot, and actually now it's considered offensive by many people. Not everybody, right? I mean, there are kind of arguments back and forth by folks who identify as trans, but again, depending on your positionality, you just might want to kind of choose the term that's going to be potentially the least offensive. Similarly with the idea, the term queer, some people find that term to be pejorative, others really prefer that term. And so you kind of have to, it's helpful to just know these things, right? So that you can kind of make an informed decision as to what you want to use. So again, this involves knowing your community. I'm going to say that there will always be advantages and disadvantages, and I'm just sort of saying here from a methodological perspective, but also, of course, from this community building perspective, to asking different questions in different ways. And so we really have to balance these two needs, right? Our needs as an evaluator to get effective and good data with a strong imperative to respect our respondents. So I'm going to sort of talk about two considerations here. And just again, to help you think through the choices. One is to ask demographic questions as open-ended questions. And I've sort of shown you some examples here. And again, this is really going to be informed by, you might not like the term gender, you might want to say sex, if that for some reason is important. You might want to say gender identity instead of just gender. Race and ethnicity are conceptualized as two different things. So you might want to ask about them in a different way. Instead of sexual orientation, you might want to say sexual preference. There, of course, are folks, depending again on what your evaluation is about, you would actually break that out into sexual preference, maybe if one's having sex, who one's having sex with. It might be attraction, right? You might want to measure change over time. This is, of course, all depending on what your evaluation is about. But this is actually supposed to say this raises on the analysis some issues that you're going to need to be willing to address. And one is that basically, how are you going to code this data, right? Like, it's pretty easy if people say male, female, man, woman, right? You're probably going to group male and men together. But what about non-standard answers? So I run studies and people sometimes write human, right? Under race actually is a pretty common one. Some people write straight under gender. So, how do I interpret that, right? I might not, I might have no more information and I can't really use then that data. I might decide that I could group them as straight under sexual orientation, but I have to make that decision then. Will you group trans women, people who use the sort of trans, say that they're trans women and women together, right? Some trans women just identify as women. That's how they'll identify themselves. Is it important to you to understand more about your participants that you sort of disaggregate women who hold different identities? These are all important issues to consider, and there really are not right or wrong answers. You might not care, right? You might say, I'm going to assume that, anyone who says woman is a cisgender woman, but can you truly assume that? And I'm going to treat them just separately from trans women, or anybody who uses the term woman anywhere in their response is going to be a woman. That's how I'm going to look at them. There are no right or wrong answers. It just depends on what you want to know, what's important for you to know in terms of your evaluation. It might not be important at all to group them, right? Who knows? So, and if something isn't important at all, you probably don't want to ask it because, again, going back to things that are important about our surveys is that they be as short as possible. Another option is to use a closed-ended question, right? So have some response categories, closed-ended question with an other response, right? So allowing people to mark themselves. If the response categories you provide don't fit, they can write themselves in as something else. You're still communicating a set of assumptions, right, about what the normative, and the term normative normal isn't about judgment. Normative is like most likely to occur, right? Identities here. That could be fine, again, depending on your respondents, but it might be alienating for some of them. And again, you just really want to know who are your, as much as you can, know who your respondents are. And then you have the decision about how you're going to categorize other data, right? And it's just similar to the decision you have to make, sets of decisions you have to make when you have open-ended data. So this was like the sort of quickest, I think, overview. But in sum, I just want you to remember, right, that survey questions are a form of communicating with our respondents. You want to show respect. You want to show that you either understand or that you're really truly willing and trying to understand their perspective and who they are. You are likely never going to get a perfect question, right? You'll never formulate the perfect question. So you're just trying to do the best you can, given your resources and what you need the information for. So be thoughtful and educate yourself and really be open to questioning your own assumptions, having other people question your assumptions. Consider having a member of the community you're working with serve as an advisor. if you're not a member of that community. Look around for questions that other people have used. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And again, context, 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 right? So just, know your context really well. Pilot your questions, yeah. So good luck. And again, as usual, feel free to contact me with any questions, or even if you just want to talk through some issues. I love talking about these things. I think they're really important to keep talking about and keep learning about. So be in touch. Okay, bye.